In a quiet American suburb, a family awoke to screams. A body, covered in blood, lay on the floor. A 13-year-old boy was named as the culprit, but his own sister was behind the accusation. Several intimate details between them emerged later, deepening the shock and devastating the entire family. The family lived in a small town in the Midwest. On the surface, they seemed like a typical American family. The father worked in construction, the mother as a cashier at a mall. They had two children, an older daughter, who was 15, and a younger son, who had recently turned 13. At first glance, their life was no different from the lives of thousands of other families in the region. However, behind this facade of normality lay a strained relationship that gradually led to tragedy. The sister was withdrawn and domineering. At school, she was known as a manipulative girl, but at home, her behavior was more assertive. She often provoked conflicts with her brother, trying to emphasize her superiority. The teenager, by contrast, was quiet and trusting, easily influenced. Their parents ignored the growing hostility, considering arguments a normal part of growing up. The first warning signs began to appear a year before the tragedy. Neighbors recalled frequently hearing screams coming from the house, and although the family never aired their problems publicly, the tension was palpable. Teachers at school noticed changes in my brother's behavior. He became sullen, avoided socializing with his peers, and sometimes came home with bruises. However, when asked about the reasons, he was evasive and tried to conceal the details. The sister gradually began to exert control over her brother in many everyday matters. She forced him to do her bidding, threatening to tell his parents certain secrets if he refused. This pattern of dominance and submission became entrenched between them and continued to escalate. At some point, she began exploiting personal, intimate aspects of their interactions to exert even more pressure. The topic itself remained taboo for the family, and so the boy had no way to complain to adults. The parents were busy with work and rarely paid enough attention to their children. Their father would come home tired in the evenings, and their mother would often take on extra shifts. Under these circumstances, the children were left alone with each other, and it was during this period that their sister increasingly pushed her brother into a trap of psychological pressure. Several close family friends noticed oddities. One of her sister's friends recalled her boasting about how easy it was to control her younger brother, and that if serious problems arose, she could always blame him. Such remarks seemed like a joke at the time, but later took on a sinister meaning. A school psychologist once noticed changes in the boy's behavior and invited his mother for a talk. But the woman dismissed the change, explaining that adolescence is always fraught with challenges. As a result, the problem went unnoticed. Thus, by the time of the tragedy, a dangerous combination of factors had come together. His parents' indifference, psychological pressure from his sister, the boy's isolation, and his inability to speak openly about what was happening. These circumstances became the backdrop against which events soon unfolded that shocked the entire neighborhood. Several months had passed since the first signs of pressure from his sister. By this time, tension within the family had escalated to such an extent that it became noticeable even to those outside the home. The boy increasingly complained of fatigue, came to school in a depressed mood, and his grades began to drop. Teachers attributed this to adolescence and domestic difficulties in the family, but the real cause lay in his sister's constant provocations and humiliation. She deliberately unsettled her brother, pushing him into actions she could later use against him. On several occasions, she spread rumors about him among his peers, portraying him as aggressive and strange. This led to further isolation for the boy at school. Many classmates began avoiding him, fearing they would be influenced by the negative stories coming from his own sister. The family atmosphere also grew increasingly tense. The parents, unaware of all the details, perceived the arguments as a result of both children's difficult years. The father believed the boy needed to become stronger and ignore it, while the mother hoped the conflicts would resolve themselves. As a result, the teenager found himself without support and effectively alone, facing constant psychological pressure. During this period, the first episodes that would later become crucial to the case began to emerge. The sister used private moments of communication to intimidate her brother. She threatened to tell his parents or friends details that could cast him in an unfavorable light. In one episode, later mentioned in the case file, she hinted at the intimate nature of their interactions. This wasn't systematic, but became a lever of pressure. The teenager was too young to understand how to respond to such manipulation and therefore complied with her demands. Soon, her behavior became more aggressive. She began suggesting to others that her brother was capable of cruel acts. In conversations with friends, she mentioned that he could lose his temper and cause trouble. Such statements weren't taken seriously at the time, but they later formed the basis of her testimony. This period culminated in several serious arguments at home. In one, his sister intentionally broke a vase and then told her parents it was her brother. In another, she showed a bruise on her arm, claiming it was a blow from her brother. The parents didn't know what to believe and, as a result, increasingly blamed their son, blaming him for most of the conflicts. With each passing day, the teenager felt increasingly cornered. He stopped communicating with friends, rarely left the house unless absolutely necessary, and avoided direct conversations with his parents. Neighbors recalled that the boy became timid and constantly looked over his shoulder, as if expecting trouble even in the most mundane situations. The sister, on the other hand, grew increasingly confident. She realized that her words were perceived by adults as more persuasive, and that her brother was incapable of defending himself. This gave her the opportunity to formulate a plan, which eventually evolved into a direct accusation of the crime against her brother. Thus, by the time the murder occurred, an artificial picture had been created. Those around him had already become accustomed to viewing the boy as prone to aggression and his sister as a victim. This position allowed her to subsequently steer the investigation in her favor, securing an alibi for herself and shifting suspicion onto her younger brother. The day of the tragedy began normally. It was a Sunday, and the parents, as often happened, were away on business. The mother went grocery shopping. The father had to visit a colleague. The children were left home alone. At the time, they were 13 and 15 years old. At first glance, this ordinary environment didn't seem to foreshadow disaster. However, that day proved to be a turning point. According to the investigation, the morning passed relatively calmly. The brother was sitting in his room playing his video game. His sister came in several times to ask him to help around the house, but he refused. A verbal altercation ensued between them. Later, neighbors claimed to have heard loud screams, although no one could make out the exact words. After lunch, the conflict escalated. The sister found a pretext for another argument. She accused her brother of ruining her school notebooks. According to investigators, this accusation was trumped up. However, it was from this point on that events began to unfold rapidly. During the argument, the sister resorted to her well-practiced tactics, accusing her brother of rudeness and threatening to tell their parents about shameful details that could embarrass him. According to the teenager's later testimony, he tried to escape the conflict and locked himself in his room. But his sister continued to provoke him, banging on the door and shouting threats. When his brother finally emerged, the argument escalated into a physical altercation. She hit him in the face and then pushed him. At some point, she even had a kitchen knife in her hand. The subsequent events were reconstructed based on the results of the investigative experiment. According to official documents, it was the sister who fatally stabbed a family member, their father, who had unexpectedly returned home early. According to the prosecution, the boy allegedly witnessed the scene and, in a panic, tried to stop his sister, but she quickly turned the tables on him. Within minutes, she called 911, reporting that her brother had attacked their father. A recording of the call has been preserved. In it, the girl can be heard sobbing and claiming that her younger brother picked up a knife and attacked her. She describes the events as if she witnessed the attack herself. When the police arrived, they found her father with multiple stab wounds. Her mother returned at the same moment and was in shock. The police acted according to the circumstances. They saw a bloodied boy with traces of blood on his hands. He later claimed he had tried to help his father. But to the officers, this seemed like clear evidence of his guilt. His sister, however, gave her first testimony at the scene, confidently asserting that it was her brother who had inflicted the blows. During the initial examination, discrepancies were noted. The direction of the wounds indicated that the blows had been inflicted by an older and physically stronger person. However, these details were overlooked in the first hours. The sister's testimony became the key. Neighbors gathered outside the house and watched as police led the teenager away in handcuffs. Many recalled hearing shouting and arguing earlier. For them, the boy's arrest seemed a logical continuation of the familiar pattern, a troubled son who was about to lose his temper. Thus, by the end of the day, the initial charges had been filed. The boy ended up in a juvenile detention center. His sister became the key witness, corroborating the theory that her brother had attacked their father. This account was recorded in the official records and formed the basis for subsequent investigations. Following the arrest of the 13-year-old boy, the case immediately attracted the attention of the police and local media. A crime committed within the family always generates public outcry. But in this case, additional interest was generated by the fact that the main defendant was a child. Within hours of his arrest, investigators developed a preliminary theory. The boy had attacked his father during a domestic dispute. This theory was strongly supported by his sister, whose testimony proved crucial. The first interrogation took place that same day. The teenager denied his guilt but appeared confused. He claimed to have found his father already wounded and tried to stop the bleeding, which is why his hands were covered in blood. However, investigators insisted his version of events didn't match his sister's account. The girl claimed to have seen her brother stab him. Despite the inconsistencies in her description, she was confused about the details and couldn't pinpoint which hand he was holding the knife with. The investigators didn't attach any importance to them. Over the course of several days, a series of examinations were conducted. Forensic experts determined that the direction and depth of the wounds were more consistent with the actions of an older teenager or adult. However, this conclusion was labeled inconclusive in the reports and was not emphasized. Much more attention was paid to the traces of blood found on the boy's clothing, which were considered direct evidence of his involvement in the attack. The sister continued to testify, each time describing the details in greater detail. In one interview with a police psychologist, she mentioned that her brother allegedly showed an unhealthy interest in her and once came in her room at night. These comments weren't directly related to the murder case, but they had a strong impact on the investigators' attitude. The teenager began to be viewed as a potential danger not only to his family, but also to those around him. The interrogations were brutal. The boy was kept in isolation and not allowed to communicate with his mother without police presence. During one interrogation, he burst into tears and admitted that he had indeed held the knife, but only when he tried to pull it out of his father's body to stop the bleeding. Investigators interpreted this as a partial admission of guilt. The state-appointed lawyer insisted the investigation was ignoring the inconsistencies. He pointed to physical characteristics. The 13-year-old boy was thin and lacked the strength to inflict such blows. But under pressure and public scrutiny, these arguments were largely ignored. The teenager's mother maintained his innocence. She claimed her son was too attached to his father to attack him. However, her words were perceived as emotional and lacking evidentiary weight. Moreover, some media outlets began publishing articles accusing the mother of failing to notice her son's aggressive tendencies. Meanwhile, new witness statements came to the investigators' attention. Several neighbors testified that they had heard arguments in the family on numerous occasions and that the teenager had allegedly threatened his sister. These statements largely corroborated the story the girl herself had advanced. A significant point was the fingerprint analysis. The brothers' fingerprints were found on the knife handle, but experts noted that they could have been made either at the time of the crime or later, when he was actually trying to help. However, the investigation concluded in favor of the prosecution's theory. With each passing day, the situation became increasingly dire for the teenager. He was portrayed on television as a teenage killer, and newspapers ran headlines about a juvenile monster. Public opinion began to take a clear stance. The boy was guilty. Meanwhile, the sister remained calm. In all her meetings with journalists and police, She portrayed herself as a victim of tragedy, speaking of her fear and how she had long felt threatened. This image strengthened her standing in the eyes of the investigators and the public. Thus, by the end of the investigation, the investigators had firmly established the theory that the 13-year-old was the killer. His sister remained the key witness. Inconsistencies in testimony, questionable evidence, and incomplete forensic examinations were ignored. All materials were submitted to court, where one of the most high-profile cases in the district in recent years would be heard. The trial of the 13-year-old boy began in the district court several months after the investigation concluded. Journalists, relatives, neighbors, and representatives of human rights organizations were present in the courtroom. The case immediately gained high-profile status, as the charges against the child were believed to be guilty of murdering his own father. From the very first hearings, the prosecutor's office built its prosecution strategy, relying on the sister's testimony. She reiterated her version. On the day of the tragedy, her brother allegedly left the room, grabbed a kitchen knife, and stabbed his father. The girl claimed to have witnessed the incident herself. In her testimony, she mentioned that her brother had long been prone to outbursts of anger and, in her words, had shown an unhealthy interest in her. This detail had no direct bearing on the murder case, but made an impression on the court and on public opinion. The teenager's assigned defense attorney attempted to build a defense based on contradictions. He pointed out to the jury that the nature of the injuries was inconsistent with the physical capabilities of a skinny 13-year-old boy. Forensic experts pointed this out indirectly, but the prosecutor insisted that the force of the blow was not a determining factor. The lawyer also requested a re-examination of the knife. The teenager's fingerprints could have appeared when he tried to remove it from his father's body and render aid. The judge denied the request, finding the results of the first examination sufficient. The teenager's mother testified for the defense. She spoke about her son's character, his closeness with his father, and insisted that he was incapable of violence. However, her words were perceived as emotional and biased. During questioning, the prosecutor bluntly stated that the mother was trying to protect her child by refusing to admit the truth. Meanwhile, the media played a significant role. Newspapers and television channels published stories under headlines like "Young Suburban Killer," creating a sense of guilt among city residents even before the verdict. For the jury, this became a backdrop difficult to ignore. The sister, by contrast, appeared calm and confident in court. She spoke of her fear of her brother, of family quarrels, and of a premonition of tragedy. The jury perceived her as a victim, a survivor of a horrific scene. Inconsistencies in her account were not publicized and were considered natural for a teenager experiencing stress. The trial lasted several weeks. The proceedings were tense. The defense attorney repeatedly emphasized the insufficient evidence against the boy, but each of his arguments was met with objections from the prosecutor, who emphasized the defendant's danger. On the crucial day, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The prosecutor demanded that the boy be found guilty of his father's murder, citing the evidence, his sister's testimony, and his own statement about holding the knife. The defense again argued that these words were taken out of context, and that the teenager was only trying to help. The jury's verdict was guilty. The court found the teenager guilty of murder. He was sentenced to a lengthy term in a juvenile correctional facility, with subsequent transfer to an adult prison upon reaching a certain age. The sister remained the key witness and faced no consequences. She received public sympathy and support from her maternal relatives. The outcome of the trial cemented the official version. The crime was committed by a teenager, and the sister became a key witness who helped restore justice. Inconsistencies and doubts in the case materials were ignored. The story ended with a guilty verdict for the 13-year-old boy. His fate was decided based on his sister's testimony. The case was officially declared closed, although many controversies remained unanswered and society remained divided in its assessment of the incident.